Director Kaneza Schaal, thank you for joining me at Cultural Attaché.
So glad to be here.
Now, you were going to be collaborating with LA Opera on Highway 1 USA by William Grant Still, which is on a double bill with The Dwarf by Alexander von Zemlinsky. So, more people probably know The Dwarf than know Highway 1 USA. So, what I want to start asking you is this work premiered in 1963, but remained relatively unperformed until Opera Theater of St. Louis did it in 2021. What do you think the two plus generations of opera goers who didn't get a chance to see this opera missed out on?
I think we missed out on maintaining American lineage. I think that this is a incredible work, and of course, still symphonic works were celebrated. Um, his operatic works weren't as widely received. So I think we missed out not only on this piece, but on Still's oeuvre, his operatic, all of his operatic works, and the idea that he started writing it in the 40s. You know, that this was birthed in the 40s and then didn't get its production until the 60s. So it really is, as you said, multiple generations who've lost this music.
Now, we can speculate, we probably don't have to go too far out on a limb to speculate why in 2021 an opera company decided to give new life to this opera. But I assume you can't do it just because of socio-political issues. You have to do it because there's something in it that warrants it as well. What do you think is at the core of this opera and the way William Grant Still tells this story that warrants continued interest in it?
Well, I think, like with so much of Still's music, there's really a sense that he's building a world. He's this music is him dreaming into existence the future, and quite frankly, the future of all of these works being in the world as well. And so with Highway 1, you know, he started writing it in the 40s, and that's in a backdrop of war. That's this moment that's the birth of American sitcom, which I very much think of as an American dreaming container, this home of our aspirational class stories. You know, the operatic canon also has lots of this, you know, station in life tensions and class struggle as well. So I think these ideas sit well in this form. But I think touching this music now is an opportunity to also be in our own moment of a backdrop of war, and you know, spending time with this music, even thinking about the kind of facade of the 50s, the kind of disjointedness of that world. What does it look like to hold the disjointedness of our world now, and what are the ways that we resolve these fractures? And I think this opera holds all of that.
Well, it's also a classic story about family dynamics. And family dynamics, though, what goes the noise that surrounds family dynamics may change over decades, but the core of what family dynamics are really remain the same, don't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that what other way through a disjointed world than loving the people we love as best we can,
In spite of their flaws,
in spite of their flaws.
because there is a very flawed character in this piece.
There is, and you know, one of the delights I have in this music is that I think there's a dissonance between the words we receive on the page in the libretto and what we hear in the kind of complexity of Nate, who I think you are referring to, the brother. The kind of complexity of Nate's music, the harmonic complexity, the ideas, the kind of um, sweeping kind of mythological landscape that his music invokes. And I think there's a way to think about this character and think about all of these characters beyond a kind of moralism. The libretto in some ways is very straightforward. You could feel it like a morality play, you know, you could feel it like a tight sitcom inside of a small apartment. But musically, there's a complexity to all of the thought, and I am very interested in what happens when we strip away the kind of moralistic lens to holding this family, and invite ourselves to really sit in the complexity of how we receive these characters in the music.
When you're thinking about all of that and you're working with your cast, a one act opera doesn't give you a lot of time. I mean, this has two scenes in it.
Yeah.
It runs an hour. There are two scenes in it. There's not a lot of time for enormous exposition about backstory and things like that, the way the opera is constructed. And I know other opera singers who have appeared in the opera have created backstories and worked with their director to create backstories. Is a backstory important for you in approaching this particular story and the way you want to present it?
In terms of backstory, I think that depends on the singers. And I cannot wait to be in the rehearsal room with them and to be building kind of the frameworks that they need to hold the music and hold the story. But for me, from my position holding the stage, the frame for this investigation and this kind of moving beyond the moralism is Mary's first music when she sings about the fox and the hare. And of course, she's drawing on Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, these African-American folklore, kind of traditions of tricksters. And these are stories that came across from Africa into America. And so I'm very interested in that trickster lineage that this opera starts with. And so we actually do have a manifestation of the fox and hare on stage to keep reminding us of these other forces that are at play as we receive the story.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up because in the movie Killers of the Flower Moon, you've got indigenous people talking about what a trickster the Leonardo DiCaprio character is and the whole
Interesting.
role of tricksters in their culture. So, I mean, the tricksters are something that have been part of every culture, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So one of the things that I was intrigued most is I saw an interview that you did around the time of Omar, and you
Mm.
talked about how, great opera operates in many different languages, and that it was your role to build a library through which a story will be told. What's the library that Highway 1 USA requires from you?
So many. So we have our fox and our hare, we have those traditions, but one of the conversations that I had early on with the production designer Christopher Myers was really thinking about this dark underbelly of these times that get presented so often in that um, plastic forward-facing 50s container. And so much was going on globally. And so we've been looking at various artists who think about disjointedness and rupture and wholeness in different ways. One of them is James Rosenquist, and another is Alma Thomas. Very different ways of dealing with rupture and joint. But those are two artists who've been important to me in how do we explode this apartment and begin in the rupture and kind of begin in the mythological landscape of these ideas. I do not come to the opera for a kitchen sink with running water. I come for myth and violence and holiness and contradiction. And so I wanted our stage to be able to hold and begin in that vastness and in the disjointed world before we find ourselves kind of in the intimacy and in the healing and union of Mary and Bob at the end.
Right. Right now, it was my understanding that William Grant Still did not put any specific mention of race into this work. And in fact, Christian Mark Gibbs, who sang Nate at St. Louis, said Still wanted it to be done by various cultural groups. Do you share that opinion of Still's intention and of this specifically for this work?
I hear it. I hear him trying to dream this world, and I think it's a challenging dream. An unraced fantasy is a challenging fantasy. It is as kind of problematic as it is glorious. And so that is what I hear in it. And I hear it in the music, and I think he meant it, and there's lots of speculation. People write about different things. Was he saying that in order to kind of protect the legacy of the work and pray that it would get produced? Or was he saying it because he was dreaming this future? And I would argue he was dreaming this future, this complex, magnificent, and also a little problematic future of this unraced possibility. And I think holding both of those things at the same time, the beauty of that vision and some of the underbelly, some of the elitism, some of the other things that get tied into that vision, I think is thrilling and is deserving of our attention.
And it, as you say that, it makes me wonder whether Still would be shocked that somebody like Terence Blanchard became the first Black composer to have his work performed at the Metropolitan Opera, or would he be shocked that it took so long?
I wonder.
I
I
mean,
wonder.
I'm shocked that it took that long,
Yeah.
but I'm living through these times, so I'm seeing what's going on. So I wonder what, somebody like William Grant Still would say, it faster than I thought, or what took you so long? Do you have any
I
thoughts?
wonder. We should get those scholars together to hypothesize what he might have thought. But I think that the power and fortitude to compose, knowing you may not see a work realized, is a kind of prayer and scaffolding that we get offered that's incredibly precious.
Well, it's the same one that Van Gogh lived with.
Voila.
Never saw his art
Mhm.
find an audience in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Um, but the opportunity to do something like Highway 1 USA with LA Opera, or the fact that the Met has finally put Black operas on its stage, and the success of Omar, do you feel like this is progress that is going to be sustainable, or do you have fear that this is a response to a moment in time?
Well, look, I don't know any way through this moment that is separated from the kind of global processing of war that's happening, that's separated from the election year terror that we have nationally, or that's separated from the immediate and existential crisis of a warming planet. And I think through all of that, we rely on our dreamers and the people who have built worlds when the world was against them, and who have left us these seeds and these scaffoldings. And I think we need artists who are very skilled in that way. And often those are artists who've been excluded from the conversation.
And you are also an artist who is included in the conversation right now, so you get to be on the flip side of that on a certain level, don't you?
Yes, it's an honor and delight to hold this music.
So let me ask you, what are the opportunities that working on a lesser known opera gives you that are different than, say, if you were doing a production of La Boheme or some war horse that comes with it immense expectations?
I think the thing about this piece is it means so much to so many people. And while it hasn't been widely presented on American stages, I think for so many artists, for so many Black artists, but also for so many people, this work has lived in their imaginations and has lived in their hearts. And so in a way, it feels like tapping in to this vast ecosystem of thought that's been going on for a long time, even if unrecorded. And so in a way, I feel like I'm stepping into a very robust conversation that, because it has not had the light on it, um, in some ways is even richer.
But are there different expectations? Compare this to Omar. Omar, when that first, was introduced to the world, came with it enormous expectations because Rhiannon Giddens was involved, because of the story, because of the time in which it was given its birth. That had a different set of expectations. You
Mm.
know, are there differences for you between lesser known works and even world premieres that people have no awareness of whatsoever?
Well, we don't get to hang out. It was nice to hang out with Michael and Rhiannon as we got to work. There's a richness to that. But I think in terms of the task as a director, of holding all of the artists who hold this music and the, what shall we call it, the weight of the task. I think um I th- incomparable, but also of the same magnitude.
All right. Well, since you could hang out with Rhiannon and you could hang out with Michael, if you could hang out with William Grant Still, what would you most want to ask him about this opera?
I would want to talk to him about the dream. I would want to talk to him about that fantasy that he is writing into that music of where we could all head. And that's what I would want to talk to him about. And I did do one thing he asked me not to do, which was put the gas station on stage. But I have done that because we need the mythological landscape of these ideas, and because I believe in my heart of hearts that he put that there because he didn't want misery porn. And he wanted the dignity and the beauty and the tenderness and the care and the exquisite attention to home craft in that apartment. And so I would also just want to run that by him and give him my pitch for why it was important.
Also, you have a very large stage to fill up, and you can't put this story in an oversized apartment.
No, we can't. But we've cut the apartment up, and it'll move around, and we will be in our disjointedness before we find ourselves.
Now, I love this idea of the fantasy that William Grant Still was writing about in Highway 1 USA. And this opera is appearing on the double bill with The Dwarf. As I mentioned, do you see there being any kind of dialogue or conversation between these two works?
Vastly. I mean, it's such a wonderful night of American music. When I first listened to Highway 1, I would get lost in the strings, and I would get kind of swept off my feet and end up in some 1950s movie, a score, a film score. And I kept having that experience. Then I would come back, I'd be like, all right, I'm in the opera again. And in talking with various friends over the course of thinking about this music, I was remembering that, of course, that sound that I might quickly topically associate with a 30s score, with a 50s score in Hollywood, that sound was built by musicians who came to that town with their instruments and who had been playing all of these canonical works. And they put that sound into those films. And that's directly from opera houses. That sound is directly from opera houses. And the poetry of that to me on this piece is I think still understood profoundly the sound of exile. I think he understood profoundly, and without hierarchy. He studied with so many different people. His like all of his time in the classical world, but also Black Swan Records and Edgar Varese. He was his musical lexicons were vast, and so I have an imagination that high and low was meaningless to him, and that he could hear the nuance and the exile and the opera in those recording sessions on those sound stages. And that in fact, when we land in the sound still is holding, he's holding it kind of past Hollywood and into all those roots that that sound was built from.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is a lot of the composers who wrote those film scores all came from Europe and were immigrants here.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
we embrace all of this music at the same time that we don't want immigrants in this country, but that's just one of the conundrums of being in America, isn't it?
I mean, yes, we all, yeah.
I think
Whether recent or many generations past, most of us have arrived here.
yes, and that's
Through
probably a
immigrants.
conversation better suited to a martini in hand.
Yes, that's right.
Um, what role do you think smaller operas like Highway 1 USA will play in the programming of opera companies large and small? And do economics and dwindling audiences require such programming?
Well, I don't know. I think it's probably easier for them to sell other tickets than this wild pairing. But I hope this wild pairing is something that people lean into. It's delightful. It's a wild evening. And I think the opera is made for bombacity and complexity and difference and collision. And so I think the double bill is actually a way to kind of lean in and invite audiences into very nuanced and complex explorations of musical lineage, like this conversation about exile to and exile in America.
But we are dealing with a performing arts world that is facing a lot of challenges right now because audiences haven't returned in droves. I mean, putting a ring cycle on, for instance, would probably be a foolish thing to do unless you had a guaranteed subscriber base that could fill an expensive production like that. I don't know what the budget was for Omar, but any of the classic operas that you do, particularly if they're new productions, are vastly expensive. Is
Yeah.
And a lot of the composers who are writing newer operas today are writing smaller chamber operas. Do you think that there's a correlation between what's being written and what the economics of opera require right now?
It feels like there are cycles where the finances of the performing arts feel outrageous and impossible, but they've always been outrageous and impossible. In fact, structural deficits are baked into nearly every cultural institution in our country. And so I think it's always been scrappier than anyone has ever wanted to admit to each other or themselves. And we know how to do it when the bank account is full, and we know how to do it when the bank account is empty. And I think we all show up and we keep telling the stories that we know are important, and we keep doing it in grand and magnificent ways, and the money does what the money does.
Which sounds like half an argument for government support of the arts. Do you think that would be a good thing or a bad thing, given how polarized government in the United States seems to be between the two major political parties?
I think that the stories we tell about ourselves and each other are the fabric of our existence, literally build the architecture and social and political interaction. And I think this fine nation could do nothing better for itself than to invest in the arts. Um, and there's been some wild, I sat on the advisory board for that Creatives Rebuild New York. It was a guaranteed income program in the state of New York. And some beautiful, beautiful, exciting things came out of that. So there are some big provocations being set forth. And I I don't know how soon we might get to a situation where that was adopted at any national level, but I do think, like the prayers that Still laid for us, and like the scaffolding that he laid for us, there's some pretty powerful scaffoldings getting sent out.
Let's hope they get realized.
Here, here.
The last thing I want to ask you is I read a conversation that you did with Alicia Hall Moran and two others with Kimberly Drew. And you said in that conversation, I am looking for an opera that tells glorious and horrific stories with grace, violence, and beauty. Moving forward, what are the stories you think that need to be told now and in the near future, whether they're set in present day or not?
So many things. I am interested in how we're all processing war right now. And so I've been in the early phases of working on a piece that takes a text from Ocean Vuong, the mighty poet who thinks so beautifully about processing war and war remnants. And I'm curious about the kind of parade of women, the kind of orgy of women dying of consumption in the canon, and the hysteria of it all. So I've got some got some irons in the fire about there. And then most of all, I'm always interested in the stories that talk about what happens in the in-between spaces and the shadows we all cast on one another. And And I think the opera is the best place for asking all of those questions.
Yeah, I'm hoping somebody does an opera about Flint.
Oh,
That has everything in it. And the fact that it's still being neglected at this point is I can't that does is not the country I grew up in.
mm,
It
yeah.
just continues, doesn't it?
There really is a way that for the kind of violence and horror of everyday life, the form has to be this big. It actually has to be this big.
Well,